Hi everyone. Welcome to joining our very first video interview on the Kite Song podcast. And it's a very special time for us because this is actually the first time I'm doing a video interview, but also because it's Eating Disorder Awareness Week. And we have a very, very special guest, a very close, wonderful friend that I've recently met at a very special conference recently, and her name is Amanda. So before we start, Amanda, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast, Wai Jia. It's an honor to get this time with you. So I'm an eating disorder counselor for a mental health facility, an eating disorder treatment facility in St. Louis, Missouri. So I'm currently serving as a clinical director there, but I specialize in the treatment of disordered eating and eating disorders.
Yeah, and it's such an honor and privilege to have you with us, Amanda. Yeah, I remember the first time we met, it was very special because some of you who are tuning into the previous podcast might know that it was a very divine and miraculous way in how I even got invited to the conference because I was asked to be one of the keynote speakers. And over there, I had the privilege of meeting many, many amazing professionals and people who were working and, serving people who are struggling with eating disorders. And Amanda was one of them. Yeah. Do you remember how we met, Amanda?
I do. So I remember that the business development director for McCallum Place was there, and he told me, I met this wonderful woman. Her name is Wai Jia, and she has these great books that I think our patients could really benefit from. You should connect with her during the conference. And so I thought, okay, I'll find her at some point. And then I heard you speak and found you to be so vulnerable and genuine and really felt moved by your story. And so went to the table where you and your husband Cliff were with the books, and I purchased some to take back to the facility and just shared with you how I was touched by hearing your story. And so that's how we first connected. And so I think in that moment we exchanged contact information and decided to get in touch after the conference to see how we might be able to connect and work together.
Yes, actually I just remembered. I'm sorry. This is like, as you can see, I'm at home. I should bring a copy of the book over. Just give me 1 second. So these are the books that Amanda was talking about that we had that day, A Taste of Rainbow. And Amanda was actually such an encouragement, such a sweet, sweet encouragement to me because, like some of you might know, I always wondered whether this book would be meaningful or impactful for people at all. And Amanda was so encouraging that she gave me the opportunity to come and speak with some of her patients through a Skype kind of call. And at first, we were supposed to do like a book reading and then use like the facilitation guide that Kite Song Global has developed to, kind of open up conversations about healing and recovery and hope and faith. But it was so funny, wasn't it, Amanda? Like in the end, the first session, it just became a pure FAQ Q&A session, right?
Yes, I think we had gone in with the intention, as you said, to do a book reading and to go along the prompts of the group facilitation guide. And our patients at McCallum Place, the ones who are participating in that group, were just so curious about you and wanted to know more about your story. They're really hungry for information about how people recover from disordered eating and negative body image and eating disorders. And so they really just wanted to hear more about your personal story.
Oh, and so Amanda has very, very kindly actually agreed to come on this episode to actually ask me some of the frequently asked questions by some of her patients. And we also have some listeners who wrote in some special questions, which I think I might even ask Amanda about what you think about them. And on the next episode, actually, we're going to have a special treat because Amanda has a real passion about helping patients recover with through the help of their families and the community. And so I have so many eager questions that I have to ask you about, about your line of work. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, without further ado, so Amanda, go ahead.
So I think that one of the reasons that I think this conversation can be helpful for people is because I think that we so often hear about struggles that people have. We all have different personal struggles that we go through, and it's really encouraging and inspiring to hear about people who have been through those struggles and are willing to be vulnerable and share about how they made it through to the other side, and how they sometimes continue to struggle, and acknowledging that that's okay, that there's no one right or wrong way to do recovery from any sort of mental health issue. So I think it's really important that we be able to share our stories. And so I think that you being courageous enough to share a bit more about your journey can really be impactful to others.
Oh, thank you, Amanda. Actually, I one thing I forgot to mention is that this episode, this special interview was really inspired by the session I had with you and your clients and patients, because, after that session, I just felt so encouraged and inspired by them, actually, by their hope and their faith, to their determination to want to recover. And that kind of made me think, I wish there was, a set of resources. I wish that that session could have been recorded, but because of patients' confidentiality, we couldn't. And I wish that there was a set of resources that we could make available. And so this is part of it. So yeah, it's really inspired by you, Amanda. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to have been a part of it. Yeah. And I think what could be helpful is if you could share a little bit more about your struggles with negative body image and your relationship with food and just mental health in general.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great question. I guess that goes back to a little bit about my upbringing, my culture, and how I viewed myself growing up. Because in a way, it's now I'm in a funny season of my life. I grew up in Asia, in Singapore, but then now, because I'm married to a Canadian, we've done a lot of traveling for humanitarian work. Right now, I'm based for a little while in Canada, and it's interesting to see how different cultures see beauty similarly and differently. Because back in Asia, I'm considered very big and tall. And so I get self-conscious about myself easily. And growing up, I was more of a chubby kid. And so what people said to me or said about me, it really cut. It was really, I felt it was very direct. And I felt that there were certain expectations that were placed on me. But the funny part was that I didn't connect that this could one day, lead to an eating disorder. It just never came across my mind. But when I was in medical school, through a very difficult period of multiple transitions, moving homes, the family business going through some sort of a crisis, and my sister leaving for overseas, a lot of multiple transitions happening at once, with the stress of medical school and leaving home, living in a dormitory, not being able to cope. I didn't realize that exercise and food started to become a coping mechanism. And I think the scary part was that as I started to lose weight, I think maybe some of your patients might be able to relate, that I began to attract like unwanted attention. People started saying that, oh, you look so good. And it started becoming an obsession with the numbers and exercise and food, to an extent where I realized that it was taking over my life. And I thought that was so weird in a way, because I couldn't even understand how it happened or why it happened like that. It just doesn't make sense, right? Like a person who's struggling with stress, well, how does it manifest in exercise and food? And I think that's something that you and I have talked about before, about how, food issues are really not about the external or about the food itself, but really about deeper issues. Yeah. So that's how it started, I think.
Yeah, I think that's how it starts for a lot of people. It's, I don't think anybody intends to develop an eating disorder, but for a variety of reasons, they start to develop a disordered relationship with their food or body, and then morphs into something else because it starts to serve an adaptive purpose or function. You were going through a lot of stressful things. You had a lot of triggers that were kind of culminating at the same time, and led to the development of a full-blown eating disorder.
Yeah. It's also funny because over the years, I realized my relationship with food was also centered around this idea of love. So in Asian culture, like food is a huge thing, and how I receive love was through food. How I give love is also through food. And so when I went through those difficult times, abstaining from food actually was maybe an expression in my head. I'm thinking maybe it was an expression of rejecting like love or feeling value in a way, which is very strange, isn't it?
It seems like it, but it does serve an adaptive and survival sort of purpose for us.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And what do you think, Amanda, about actually maybe this is a question for you, but one of our listeners was asking, a couple of questions about how do we, control or curb, some of their eating kind of cravings or binges. And when I looked at those questions, I realized that sometimes we're looking for a formula, like what to do or what not to do. But when I looked at those questions, I realized that what's more important is to ask, what are the things that are triggering those moments, right?
Right. Yes, I agree. I think you have to understand the function of the behavior. I think in our society, we've sort of demonized emotional eating. So eating to meet emotional needs or to temporarily distract from some sort of negative emotional experience. And that in and of itself is not bad. So eating can be very soothing. Food can be very soothing. It elicits a lot of positive emotions and experiences. So that in and of itself isn't a negative behavior. But if we're starting to use that as our only coping skill, if it's the only thing that we have to be able to cope in difficult situations, if it's starting to take a toll on our health, or we're starting to eat in secret, it's interrupting or interfering with relationships with other people, then that's something that we really need to look at and address. And so I think you have to understand the function of the behavior and why we're doing what we're doing before you can really understand how or what needs to be changed, because there's not always a problem. Emotional eating is not always a problem. It just depends upon the mindset that you have and the larger context around that behavior.
Wow. That's very wise and very deep in a way, because I think sometimes we have a very narrow idea of how we should be and how we have to be. And then when we go out of that, we feel like, oh, there's something wrong with myself. And I think what's really important to see is that what is the underlying kind of emotions and the thoughts that are behind that, and to look at those and see, like, what are the areas that I need to address? Like, was it something someone said, or was it because I was feeling really badly that day, and addressing those instead of just, how do I avoid those moments of, restriction or overindulgence.
Yes. Well, and so for you, Wai Jia, as you learned that you had actually developed a full-blown eating disorder, and you started to realize the impact that some of these contributing factors were having on your life, what were the steps that you took to get treatment? How did you know that you were in need of help?
Wow, that is a great question. I was in complete denial. And I'm saying this from the perspective of being even a medical student. So you can see how strong the denial aspect of the mental illness is. But people were telling me that, you look really ill. My hair was falling out. My periods had stopped. And I was just, when I went for a bone density scan, it was actually like that of like an elderly woman's. So that was when I knew that there was something wrong with me. And I was feeling really depressed all the time because I was just not having enough food. But one day I remember a close mentor of mine, she came and she challenged me. She actually brought me out for lunch, and she knew that something was wrong. And she said, Wai Jia, if there's nothing wrong with you, why don't you take the first step and see a psychiatrist, see somebody from the treatment center. And if there's nothing wrong with you, you'll be discharged. It's as simple as that. She just gave me a challenge, and I thought to myself, I didn't want to. I really did not. But I realized that I had to. And I think the biggest motivation for me was realizing that because my faith is a very personal part of my journey, I felt that God had a plan for me. And that was to, be a physician and to help others. And perhaps this was a journey that I had to walk through to help myself before I could embark on this journey of helping others. And so with that, I took the first step. It was actually quite difficult to get an appointment, unfortunately. And when I did, I was really surprised to see how holistic and intense the program was, because at one point I was seeing like a dietitian and a psychiatrist and a psychologist and a family therapist, and I was like, well, wow, this is a lot.
Well, I know a question that our patients at McCallum had asked you when you joined the group was, did you go to a program like a higher level of care? Or, you know, when you're talking about the different treatment providers that you were working with,
Right.
how did that all come together?
Wow, it was really awkward for me actually, because at that time, a lot of my classmates were doing their psychiatry posting, and some of them were posted to the same place that I was receiving treatment from. And so the doctors, they were really kind. They realized that it was potentially very, very awkward, you know, if I was an inpatient. So I underwent 1 year of intensive outpatient care. That meant, you know, seeing a healthcare provider almost every week at some point. So I wasn't actually hospitalized, but it was very intense for about a year or so, in and out of, outpatient therapy. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like you could have benefited from a higher level of care, but because you knew a lot of the providers who were providing that treatment, your team came up with an alternative plan to make sure that your treatment needs were being met.
Yeah, which was really nice too, because I guess knowing that they knew about my situation and circumstances. But I think one of the real breakthroughs that came was when I realized that my family had to be involved. Yeah, and that was the real turning point for me. Yeah.
So how did you come to realize that your family needed to be involved?
Wow. It was really hard, because I think like many of the patients that I've interacted with, like there's always this sense of stigma and shame, and this terrible feeling like, oh, you know, if somebody finds out, like my parents or, you know, my siblings, if they find out, it's going to be tragic. But the fact is that they do know something is wrong.
Yeah.
And I think what was really, because you work with a lot of families, right, Amanda? And I think what was funny was how when my therapist suggested to meet my family, I was like, no, you can't do that. It's gonna be awful. Like, you can't tell them I'm not gonna come anymore. But when she finally convinced me, I was so relieved and thankful and encouraged as well, because my parents were actually relieved to be part of this support group, and they started to learn how to support me better and how to react or not react when, you know, they saw certain behaviors that were happening at home. And I think because so much of the tension and the difficulties, the challenges are rooted in some way in within the family dynamics, like this was extremely helpful and extremely liberating. So it's a big step of faith, I know, because I think a lot of people who are in it always feel like they can't do it. They can't tell anyone.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that something that we often say in treatment facilities is that eating disorders thrive in isolation. It's not something that we can recover from alone. And so incorporating either family of origin or family of choice, which can include friends or other forms of support, is going to provide the best outcomes for treatment. We're going to have the best success when we allow others to be a part of the process, even though that can feel counterintuitive to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is exciting for me, because in the next episode, I'll be asking you about, you know, your experiences with families and communities, because I know that's something that you're very passionate about.
Yes. Well, and just to clarify for your listeners, so there's disordered eating, which is, you know, having a negative relationship with food or body. And then there's an eating disorder, which means that you meet clinical criteria for a diagnosed eating disorder. And so if disordered eating morphs into something that meets the full DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders, if it meets full criteria, then it means that certainly treatment and a higher level of care is indicated. But that can look very different for a lot of people. So on a basic level, treatment would be working with a therapist and maybe an outpatient dietitian or a psychiatrist if there's a need for medication, psychotropic medication.
Right.
But if there are medical complications, like you were looking at, bone density loss and some physical ailments as a result of the disordered eating and malnutrition, then higher levels of care may need to be sought. But it's always helpful to start with an outpatient team who specializes in disordered eating or eating disorders and can then make recommendations for higher levels of care if needed. So just in case your listeners are wondering, if I'm struggling with negative body image or where do I start to look for professional help?
I agree.
And higher levels of care can seem so confusing because there are a lot of different terms and language and options out there that if you're not familiar, it can be very overwhelming.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, Amanda, because I think something that is very overwhelming sometimes is realizing that, maybe it's not that bad, Like, that's what I told myself for the longest time, even though when I was so sick, I just told myself, I don't look like, Karen Carpenter. I'm not on the verge of death, I'm doing fine. And I think what you mentioned is so key because so many so-called eating disorders go undiagnosed.
Yes.
And it's so important to realize that a big part of this is also the aspect of denial. So I think a very brave step that anyone can take is actually to very honestly and candidly speak to a close friend about it. It may not necessarily be family, but if you're wondering, if you're listening in and you're wondering, like, do I have an eating disorder? Do I have a problem? Because this is taking up more and more of my mental space. Then it's time to talk to someone that you can trust, someone that you can love, because they'll be able to give you an objective idea. And I think one thing I realized over the years is that there is so much support online. Yeah, I think some of the resources that we've seen and we've talked about, I'll actually put them in the show notes. The conference that we were at, it was called Hungry for Hope, and it was organized by Finding Balance, wasn't it? And they have an online support group, and there are also lots and lots of different resources which we'll make available at the end of the show. But just go online, take a look, and if you feel that it's time to speak to someone about it, like my suggestion is go for it. Like, there's no harm in speaking to someone that you trust or you love about it. Yeah,
I would agree. And so after receiving treatment from this team of professionals, what has the journey looked like for you post-treatment? And there's no universal definition for recovery from an eating disorder. But what has your journey to recovery looked like post-treatment?
Wow. That is a great question. And I remember even one of the ladies asking me, like, is it ever possible to fully recover? Yeah. And how does recovery look like? I guess for me, when I was discharged, it was a big milestone because it just meant that, physically I was well enough. But I was also very conscious of the fact that thoughts would come back, or like there could be relapses, because relapses are fairly common. And I began to see that recovery is really a journey. Like you rightly mentioned, it's a journey because it's a journey of hope and a journey of faith. Like, there are times where I realized that I was discharged, but certain incidents would re-trigger those emotions, those thoughts. And I used to think to myself, I was very hard on myself, as thinking that, if this comes back, it means that I'm ill again, I'm terrible, I'm a failure. And then I learned how to be gracious with myself, realizing that it's not about failing and blaming myself, but it's about falling forward. I can't remember where I read this or heard this, but falling forward was a concept that strengthened me so much, realizing that it's okay to fall because I'm falling forwards. I'm moving ahead. And I remember this vision that I had, and it was a spiral that went upwards. And sometimes we might feel like, we're going back in the same cycle. Why am I at the same spot? But when you look at the spiral, even though you feel like, I'm coming back and I'm getting a relapse, you're actually at a higher place. It's no longer the same old triggers that are triggering you for the same reasons, but it could be maybe more intense or more different circumstances, a higher stress level that caused it. And just by that fact, it means that you've progressed to a different level. And so I see recovery as like a spiral going upwards of progress. And there are cycles that we go through. Sometimes, we go through different life stresses and all that. But it's so important to encourage ourselves to realize that it's okay. And it's part and parcel of recovery. Yeah.
Yes, there's no straight line continuum.
Exactly.
And it can be a lot of ups and downs and very messy. And it sounds like for you, you realize that as you've learned more about yourself and your triggers and how to cope, that you aren't spiraling backwards, that you're still moving forward with all of the additional insight and knowledge and experience that you've gained.
Yes. It's so true, because I remember even being able to speak about it, that is another milestone. Being able to speak about it without being triggered, being able to then help others, that whole thing is, I almost feel it's like a lifelong journey. Not to say that, wow, recovery is so hard, it takes your whole life, but it's a deeper progression. It goes deeper and deeper and sweeter, I would say. Even this opportunity, to just, interview, like for us to record this and to be able to bring light and hope to others. This is, I feel it's a part of my recovery journey too, in a way.
Well, and I think that's something that patients often want to know of a recovery speaker, and something that McCallum patients asked of you was, do you still have thoughts? Do you still struggle with negative body image? Because in treatment, we often say that negative body image is the last thing to go. And it takes a lot of time to fully recover from that. So what are your thoughts about that, Wai Jia?
Wow, I'm going to be completely honest with you. Like, it's a very real thing. Like, it kind of over the years, it has been at the back of my head, especially like, with so much media and the pressures of, societal expectations and all that. And actually recently now I'm expecting our second child. I'm now 8 months pregnant. And it was funny because when I first became pregnant, I went through multiple transitions. And actually, I shared with Amanda as a friend that I was a little concerned whether all these multiple stresses of, moving homes and moving countries with a toddler and, moving from being a very high energy, intense physician to a stay-at-home mom, that transition was very unsettling for me. And then I started to realize that, wow, I started to have thoughts about negative thoughts that were coming back again, that were familiar to me. And I thought to myself, oh dear, like, is this coming back? But I think the difference was that this time I recognized it very early on, and I was able to nip it in the bud and say that you're not going to get me this time, because I'm going to reach out for help. I remember speaking with some of my colleagues who were or some of my friends who knew about this, and I was able to share with them, and they were able to check in on me from time to time and ask, how are you doing, how are you coping, and realizing that I can have the power and the control to prevent this from happening. And so I actually took an additional step, because at that time we were going through so many incredible stresses. It was quite divine that my treatment provider in Singapore actually had a very, very close friend who was working in the hospital that was right in my neighborhood in Canada. And for me, that was just a little mind-blowing. So she said, why don't you just go say hi to him, just, make an appointment, just say that, I just asked you to go and say hi. And I did. And the amazing thing was that he just was so wonderful. He was very kind, and he walked me through pretty much the whole of my pregnancy. And I was stable, and I am stable to the point where actually next week they've asked me to be one of their recovery speakers too.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So I think, so to answer your question, I think the key is really to reach out, like when you feel that something's not going right, and not to be ashamed. Like I at one point I was a little pressured. I was like, oh, now I'm like, I'm doing all these speaking engagements. How can I doubt myself? But then I realized that when you're helping others and when you're in such an intense situation, all the more you need to kind of guard your heart, guard your mind, and take precautions, and there's no shame in that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds like you really realize what your vulnerabilities are. And
Yeah.
when you're really vulnerable for a relapse and you're starting to experience those thoughts creeping back in, you just ask for help to try to nip it in the bud
It's
and
true.
prevent things from spiraling to a point that it becomes out of control again.
Yes, yes. Oh, and sorry, just to go back to your question, because you asked, like, do the thoughts always, are they always there? And I think one beautiful thing about our journeys is that, as we spiral upwards, as we get closer and closer to, understanding ourselves and people. And for me, my personal journey is as I understand God more and more, and how we are made beautifully and wonderfully in His image. I realize that, wow, like, I've become more and more secure in who I am. And there is less and less need for comparison or to feel like I have to be a certain way, because we're all made so differently. And so I think that journey of self-acceptance, of realizing that there's so much more outside of us, that I think that kind of takes away that inward focus on yourself, when you realize that there is so much that I can do in the world. There is so much light that I can be, or I can learn from, when there's that lack of, or a decrease of, focusing on yourself and more on others and on God. Or I realize that, yeah, that helps me so much to not continually have, that those thoughts of self-awareness. Yeah.
Yes, that makes sense. I think that eating disorders can be a bit egocentric, and that we're very much focused on image and self-preservation and how others perceive us. And if we can step outside of that and become attuned to our spiritual connection with God, connection with other people, things outside of ourselves, it can allow us to be reminded that there's more to life than just physical body and our own internal struggles. That there are ways that we can contribute that can be very empowering and uplifting, and a part of our recovery process.
Absolutely. I agree. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, other things that our patients had asked you when you came to talk were more about how you deal with triggers, like someone saying something to you or a comment on your appearance or body. So you spoke a little bit about how that impacted you in the past, but how does that impact you today?
Wow, that is a very tough question, actually. Especially for me, one of my love languages is words of affirmation. So words, they either build me up or they really cut to the core. And especially in Asian culture, something that happens quite frequently is being very direct sometimes, although we're a conservative society. But like recently, there's this festival called Chinese New Year, and it happens either in January or February. So this year it's actually in February, and usually when people go visiting their families, one of the first things they'll ask you is, have you eaten? And then the next thing that commonly happens is, oh, you look so, and then fill in the blanks. So it can be very direct, especially if somebody is going through a very difficult time. And so for me, that has been my greatest struggle, actually, dealing with people's comments and learning to manage them. And I think one thing that has really helped me is something that my husband Cliff always affirms me with. And he says, why does it matter what they think? And that question has been extremely powerful for me, because I realize that I can do all the processing I want. I can be angry at them. I can, use self-righteous thoughts and say, they have no right to tell me that. I remember after my first pregnancy with my baby, 3 months later, I was at a gathering, and like during a moment of pin drop silence, one of the ladies asked me, and she said, how much weight do you put on, like, through your pregnancy? And I was like, and so I was a little shocked, and I just told her, I said, I didn't put on much, because it was like maybe like 2 pounds or something. I don't know. I don't remember the number, but it didn't matter to me back then. And the next thing she said was, that's impossible. You were very skinny at your wedding. And so that incident kind of traumatized me. I told my husband, I'm not seeing anybody for a while. Okay, I don't want any of these unsolicited comments.
It's so interesting though that people feel like they have the right to comment on our body.
I know, it's so funny. But I think these are so real, and they can really trigger, something that's very deep within. And I remember that there were all these thoughts about, I should have said something, or I need to say something, all these self-righteousness that comes up. And then my husband asked me the question. He said, why does it matter so much to you what people say? And when I ask myself that question, I think it brings up the fact that I have centered my a significant part of my life around the need for approval.
Yes.
And when I challenge myself to ask why, then I feel like something in me gets liberated. Because the truth that really matters is at least for myself, what God thinks of me. And if that is enough, and it should be, and it is, then why do people's opinions matter so much? Mm-hmm. And then when I saw that I did not have to be a slave to what other people thought of me, that became tremendously freeing. And so now whenever someone says something, and now I'm pregnant again, and I'm like, oh my, what's going to happen? But I ask myself, the next time if somebody says something really radical like that again, I will probably just smile it off. And when I go back home, I'll probably just tell myself, it doesn't matter what they said.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Just remembering, again, that there's a deeper meaning to how we interpret things, and being really curious about why other people's reactions or responses or questions hurt us or affect us so deeply, and what is the function of how we attempt to cope with that.
I agree. And I think because many of our listeners are, they have a strong faith in God. Something I want to mention as well, which I don't mention in a lot of places because, they tell you not to talk too much about spirituality and all that, is that I think what's really, really important is that as you journey in life, as you journey towards, a deeper sense of fulfillment, the only way you can really do that is to really embrace the fact that we have been made in such a divine way, and that continue to seek who God has made you to be. Mm-hmm. Continue to seek God himself even, because without that, it's always going to be centered around me and my issues and my goals. And I think the scary part about counseling sometimes is, and I don't know if you agree with this, Amanda, but sometimes I feel like we can be so inward looking. It just goes deeper and deeper and deeper, but then it doesn't necessarily get better. And I think that there needs to be a balance. Like as we go deeper within ourselves, we also need to go outwards and upwards towards others and towards God. And when that comes into balance, then I feel like that's when true freedom can come in.
Yes, I agree with that. And I think from my perspective, and we'll talk more about this probably in the next podcast, but the impact of involving others and connecting with others. So, a lot of times in therapy, we do want people to understand or gain insight into how they function as human beings and why they do the things that they do, so that they can learn how to cope effectively, to replace those old habits that aren't working for them with things that are more helpful to get their needs met. And then once they have that foundation, now how can we bring other people in? How can we allow other people to support us and the work that we're doing? And then how can we connect with something greater than ourselves and even our family members? How can we connect with God and tap into our spirituality and find meaning and purpose in our lives, so that we're not finding meaning and purpose through weight loss and eating disorders and eating a specific way or whatever it is, but how can we contribute and find meaning and purpose in a larger way?
I agree. Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing that, Amanda. Thank you. Mm,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think that it will be really helpful for people to hear about your journey and the things that have been impactful and meaningful to you in recovering from mental health struggles.
Mm, wow. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, yeah, the last question that I have from our, do you have any more questions, by the way?
Well, I guess I would ask,
Okay.
if you have thoughts about how best to help someone who's struggling with mental health
Okay.
issues, not just an eating disorder, but I think I have a perspective as a mental health clinician, but for you having a personal experience, what do you find to be most beneficial if you notice that a loved one is struggling? What might someone do or say?
Wow. That's perfect because that's actually what the question that one of our listeners wrote in to ask. Yeah, like how do you help someone who is in need and how do you encourage them? And I think over the years I've received questions from people who are really struggling, especially parents or like uncles and aunts, because they see like their nieces or daughters or sons who are struggling and they don't know how to approach them. And I think the intuitive way is always just eat more
Mhm.
or just do it, or can you not go out and exercise so much? There's that sense of that need to instruct or to tell, and I think unfortunately that can be very counterproductive. I think the best way, at least in my opinion, is the approach of love. And I know it might seem very slow, it might seem frustrating, but one verse that comes to my mind is, love is patient and love is kind. When I look back at my own journey, I realized that the people who helped me the most were not the ones who gave me the best advice or here's where to find the list of resources,
Yeah.
but really people who spent time with me to journey with me. And recently, I was speaking with a parent who had emailed me to talk about some of the struggles that he and his daughter was going through, and he confessed to me. He wrote me a very long email, saying how he feels very guilty because in his entire father daughter date that they had, which was very precious, he said, I didn't approach her about her eating disorder. I didn't approach her about her struggle with faith, and I was just there with her. I watched a movie and then I listened to some of her dreams and aspirations, and I just encouraged her. And he's like, I feel so. I don't know if I did the right thing. That was basically what he was sharing, and I had to really encourage him because I think he did a wonderful thing, which was to invest in his daughter's life, to be there for her, to show her that he's not just there to give her instructions or to tell her what to do or to just ask her to go for treatment and um, do this or that. And I think she really felt loved, and that was his feedback. He was like, it was so amazing because she felt loved, and his daughter is continuing to go for treatment. And so I think this approach of being loving, of being encouraging, and being patient, I think the key is patience, because a lot of us just want a quick fix. Like,
Yes.
tell me a formula that I can have to help my loved one, and I don't have a formula. Your loved one may, or your friend or your daughter or your son might take a couple of months, or they might take longer than that. They might take years. But what I think is most crucial is your faith that they will recover, and your love for them, because that's going to be what helps them through the most. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think sometimes when we're in the midst of it, if we're struggling with mental health issues, we don't always hold a lot of hope for ourselves. So if people can pour faith and hope into us and pray over us and walk alongside us, we don't
Yes.
have to do anything but just be there and to
Yes.
know that we're not alone and that other people are holding faith and hope for us. That could be
Yes.
really powerful.
Yes. And maybe some practical ways would be, to offer to get involved in their treatment. Like, would you like me to come with you? Or would you like to let your therapist know that I'll be happy to come for a session, with or without you, whatever works best. Those are wonderful ways. And also, I think some books and resources for, how to help a loved one with an eating disorder. There are lots of books out there.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And how about you, Amanda? How do you feel about this? Like, what's the best way for a loved one to help?
I completely agree. I think just approaching them from a place of love and curiosity, not assuming that you know or understand,
Right.
being very curious and asking questions. And, you know, I think even when it comes to food, I agree that a lot of times people go to, you know, giving instruction. They don't understand that it's not just about the food. And so when someone's not eating, there's so much more happening internally than just, you know, trying to avoid or restrict or binging on food.
Yes.
So instructing them to have a different relationship is not helpful. But something that can be helpful that I've heard patients say over and over again is to ask, what's going on? How are you doing?
So
How can I
true.
help? So if you're noticing that something is going on and you don't know what to say, just asking them how they are and ways that you can support can be really meaningful.
So
Even if you're
true.
not willing to share or to accept the help in that moment, a seed has
Right.
been planted that you are willing to be a part of the journey with them.
I so agree. I so agree. And even as you share that, something that comes to mind is, you know, I've met people or interacted with people who are helping a loved one so much that they themselves have become affected negatively, either through, you know, feeling like hopeless or depressed, or I actually met a young lady recently who was helping her friend so much through a in a very, very young age, to the point where she also realized that she was starting to get some of the, you know, symptoms. She was starting to unconsciously mimic some of the restrictive behaviors. And so when she shared that with me, I realized that, wow, even as you support someone, make sure that you get support for yourself as well. Yeah, go find someone else to talk to. You know, you don't have to divulge, you know, confidentiality, but just, you know, have your own support group. Let someone know that you're going through this. You know, if there is such a thing as, you know, a parent support group, go join that. Go get some, you know, encouragement, advice, spiritual feeding and nourishment, just for yourself, your self-care. That's really important too.
Yes, I
Yeah.
agree completely.
Yeah. Oh, wow. So I guess that's all the questions we have. Am I correct?
Yes.
Oh, but thank you so much, Amanda. It was so nice to have you with us. Yeah, you're just you being here has, you know, has given us so much inspiration and encouragement, and we just thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Oh, and we look forward to having you on our next episode, where I'll be asking you a couple more questions about, you know, how families and communities can get involved and how we can, you know, be a part of that hope and healing process.
I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, Wai Jia.
Oh, thank you, Amanda. See you soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye.